Happy learning, virtual learners! It's nice to virtually be with you again. Welcome to another episode of Valenzuela Live and English 10. Join me as we engage ourselves in another fun and meaningful learning session. This is Ma'am Eileen Crisostomo serving you the lesson for today. For your attendance, just type or key in hashtag acronym of your school and your section. I would also like to remind you of the word respect because that is what we need as we go along our discussion. Today, we will still be guided by the same most essential learning competency we had last session. Appraise the unity of plot, setting, and characterization in a material viewed to achieve the writer's purpose. Also, same specific objectives will be used. Read closely to get the author's purpose and explain how the elements specific to a genre contribute to the theme of a particular literary selection. To guide you as we recall what we have talked about last engagement, we will still utilize the alternative delivery mode prepared by Mr. Jericho D. Ignacio, a master teacher from Dalandanan National High School. Last session, we once again talked about the different story elements and discussed them deeper. Since you were able to learn about the same topic twice, I assume it would be easier for you to follow as we discuss a story and identify its elements. This time, let us first recall the different story elements through this activity. You have to identify the element being described through the icons and their corresponding letters. You just simply have to match the given icons with their corresponding letters to form word or words. Once you've already thought of the answer, feel free to type it in the comment box. Flashed on the screen are the letters together with their icons. Let's begin with this literary element that involves a struggle between two opposing forces. These are the icons. Type your answers in the comment box. Right, the element being described is the conflict. I hope that you still remember the different types of conflict a certain story has. Let's proceed to the next story element. This is the trunk from which all the other elements grow, and it is used to describe the events that make up a story. Here are your clues. The answer is plot. Again, plot refers to the sequence of events in the story starting from the exposition, rising action, climax, falling action, and resolution. The next element can be a person in a work of a fiction and can be identified as protagonist or antagonist. These are the icons. You may now type your answers. Very good. The answer is character. You have to remember that a character in a story may be categorized as dynamic, static, round, and flat. We also have this element that pertains to the place and time of the action. In some stories, it simply provides a backdrop for the actions and characters. These are the clues. The answer is setting. Again, setting is not just merely a place but also includes the cultural background against which the action takes place, the customs, ideas, values, and beliefs of the society in which it occurs. This element refers to the underlying message that the writer or author wants to get across. Here are the clues. The answer is theme. Again, sometimes the theme is stated directly, but more often, however, the theme is conveyed indirectly through the characters, events in the story, or literary devices employed by the writer. Next element is basically the writer's attitude towards his or her audience or readers. Here are your clues. Definitely, it is the tone. Tone depends on the combination of different factors, including the connotation of the words used, the word choice, the use of figurative language, and the mood. Last element has something to do with the feeling created in the reader by the story. These are your clues. And the answer is Mood. You did great, learners. It just proved that you've almost mastered the story elements. But enough with the definitions of these elements. Today, let's discuss a story and distinguish its elements. Are you familiar with Greek mythology? Greek mythology, as in other ancient cultures, was used as a means to explain the environment in which humankind lived, the natural phenomena they witnessed, and the passing of time through the days, months, and seasons. Myths were also intricately connected to religion in the Greek world and explained the origin and lives of the gods, where humanity had come from and where it was going after death, and gave advice on the best way to lead a happy life. The Greek myths also have a pantheon of gods and goddesses who rule and order the universe. I'm pretty sure that if I ask you to name a god or goddess you are familiar with, you will say Aphrodite, Athena, Poseidon, or Zeus. Well, they are indeed some of the most famous Greek gods and goddesses. But aside from them, there are also a lot of other characters that you'll get to know. Dear virtual learners, join me as we enter the world of Greek mythology. Before we proceed with the selection, which we will discuss today, let me first introduce to you the 12 gods and goddesses of Mount Olympus, which are known to be the most important deities in ancient Greece. With their all too human qualities, the Olympian gods were capable of displaying great kindness and dishing out terrible punishments. They argued among themselves, had love affairs, and protected their favorite mortals down on earth. But each had a more serious role to play in the Greek view of the world, and so they represented important ideals and features of the human condition, such as justice, loyalty, wisdom, beautiful music, and the changing of seasons. The 12 Olympian gods are the following: Zeus, Hera, Poseidon, Demeter, Athena, Apollo, Artemis, Ares, Hephaestus, Aphrodite, Hermes, and Dionysus. Let's begin with Zeus. He is the king of the Olympian gods and the supreme deity in Greek religion. Often referred to as the Father, as the god of thunder and the cloud gatherer, he controlled the weather, offered signs and omens, and generally dispensed justice, guaranteeing order amongst both the gods and humanity from his seat high on Mount Olympus. Hera, the wife of Zeus and queen of the ancient Greek gods, represented the ideal woman and is goddess of marriage and the family. God of the sea and rivers, creator of storms and floods, and the bringer of earthquakes and destruction, Poseidon is perhaps the most disruptive of all the ancient Greek gods, not only for mortals but also to Zeus' peaceful reign on Mount Olympus. Demeter guarantees fertility of the earth and protected both farming and vegetation. Goddess of wisdom, war, and crafts, Athena is possibly the wisest, most courageous, and certainly the most resourceful of the Olympian gods. Apollo is a major Greek god associated with bow, music, and divination. Artemis is the Greek goddess of hunting, wild nature, and chastity. The daughter of Zeus and sister of Apollo, Artemis is regarded as a patron of girls and young women and a protectress during childbirth. Ares is the Greek god of war and perhaps the most unpopular of all the Olympian gods because of his quick temper, aggressiveness, and unquenchable thirst for conflict. Ancient Greek god of fire, metallurgy, and crafts, Hephaestus is the brilliant blacksmith of the Olympian gods for whom he fashioned magnificent houses, armor, and ingenious devices. Ancient Greek goddess of love, beauty, desire, and all aspects of sexuality, Aphrodite can entice both gods and men into illicit affairs with her good looks and whispered sweet nothings. Hermes is the ancient Greek god of trade, wealth, luck, fertility, animal husbandry, sleep, language, thieves, and travel. And last, Dionysus is the ancient Greek god of wine, merriment, and theater. Being the bad boy of Mount Olympus, he was perhaps the most colorful of the Olympian gods. Aside from these 12 Olympians, there are more characters in Greek mythology. Let us get to know more of them as we deal with the story of Orpheus and Eurydice. As mentioned, myths are stories about gods and goddesses and heroes passed from one generation to another. Many Greek myths have a great deal of influence on our culture. For ages, writers, artists, and musicians have used mythological characters as their inspiration. The story of Orpheus and Eurydice is one of the 8 tales of lovers in Greek mythology. Have you ever experienced losing someone you love? Have you ever gotten a second chance to be with him or her, but unintentionally waste it? Well then, this story might be for you. The story begins with an introduction of the main characters, Orpheus and Eurydice. Orpheus is an ancient Greek legendary hero endowed with superhuman musical skills. Whenever he plays his lyre, he does it so sweetly that it can charm all things on earth. Eurydice is a beautiful nymph and one of the daughters of Apollo. They fell in love with one another, and when they were married, they looked forward to many years of happiness together. But soon after, Eurydice stepped on a poisonous snake and died. We can observe that just like the other typical stories, its exposition narrates to us the background information of the characters and introduces the conflict. The major conflict of this story is when Orpheus lost Eurydice because of a snake bite. Heartbroken, Orpheus roamed the earth, singing sad melodies to try to get over his grief. The pain he felt was too much that he decided to follow Eurydice to the underworld. Obviously, the author used narrative exposition or exposition through narration. Based on our discussion last episode, this is the insertion of background information within a story or narrative. This information can be about the setting, characters' backstories, prior plot events, historical context, etc. Although the story started at the land of the living, where they got married, majority of its parts happen in the underworld. Take note, learners, that in a certain story, there may only be one setting, but there are also stories which may have various settings or events that occur in many different places and times. For some stories, the setting plays an important role, while for others, it does not. Do you think the underworld plays a significant role in this story? We'll find out a little later. Hidden deep within the bowels of the earth and ruled by the god Hades and his wife Persephone, the underworld was the kingdom of the dead in Greek mythology, the sunless place where the souls of those who died went after death. In order to gain entrance to the underworld, you descend into the mouth of a cave, travel downward for a bit, and then cross the river Styx, the boundary between the realms of the living and the dead. The rising action begins when Orpheus ventured himself to the land of the dead to get his wife back. He reached the river Styx and plucked his lyre again. Cerberus, the fierce three-headed dog who guarded the gates, heard the sweet music and lay still to let him pass. Orpheus continued to play his lyre tenderly as he made his way through the gloomy underworld. In this part of the story, we also met some minor characters who also heard the music which Orpheus played. Sisyphus, who had been condemned to roll uphill forever, stopped his fruitless work to listen. Tantalus, who had been sentenced to stand in a pool of receding water, stopped trying to quench his thirst. And even the whale which Ixion was tied as punishment stopped turning for one moment. When he finally reached the palace of Hades, the Greek god of the dead and the ruler of the underworld, He immediately began his gentle song pleading for Eurydice, even before they could order him to leave. When Hades heard the song, he began to weep. Cold Persephone was so moved that for the first time in all her months in the underworld, her heart melted. So it just proves how powerful Orpheus' music is that he was able to melt Persephone's heart. The rising action continues as Persephone convinced Hades to let the two be reunited. Hades was convinced to let Eurydice go, but her release comes with a catch. Eurydice must walk behind him as they ascend to the upper world, and Orpheus is forbidden from looking at her. Both grateful, the lovers left the underworld and made their way through the dark passage that led them to the upper world. In this part of the plot, we also learned the significance of the story setting and how it affects the other elements, specifically the mood. Setting is one of the first things to be described in a narrative and therefore plays a major role in establishing the mood. The way the underworld is described in the selection gives us an eerie feeling. The setting also made the journey of Orpheus more challenging at first, but because of his own supernatural musical ability, he made it to Hades' abode. What have you observed with the story's rising action? Was it able to meet the key defining features of rising action? First, the rising action begins with an inciting incident or complication. When we say inciting incident or event, it refers to an event that produces a problem or conflict for the characters and sets in motion a series of increasingly important events that constitute the story's main events. Again, the problem faced by the main character is how to bring his wife back to the earth. In the rising action, we were able to find out what Orpheus did to be with Eurydice again. Moreover, the rising action is typically the longest part of the story. Obviously, a lot of things happen during this stage as Orpheus courageously traveled to the world of the dead. Another feature is the rising action builds tension or suspense. I would like to emphasize the word builds. Do not be confused because this is just the part of the story where the tension starts to develop. It is not yet the turning point. Let's go back to the story and find out its climax. Orpheus agreed with Hades' condition that Eurydice must walk behind him as they travel back to the upper world, but he is forbidden from looking back at Eurydice until they have left the underworld. Seems easy, right? But were they able to leave successfully? The couple began their ascent. Orpheus can hear Eurydice's footsteps behind him, and before long he can see the exit. He steps out of the cave and into the light. He made it. I can see the daylight ahead, called Orpheus to Eurydice. We are almost there. But Eurydice had not heard him, so she did not answer. Bothered, Orpheus turned to make sure that she was still following him. He totally forgets about Hades' warning and turns to his wife. That, dear learners, is the turning point of the story. If you were Orpheus, would you have looked back to see if Eurydice was still following? The climax dispels much of the tension or answers many of the questions that arose during the rising action. Here we became excited to find out if Orpheus would be able to successfully bring his wife back to the underworld. The tension apparently rises when Orpheus looked back at Eurydice when they almost reached the earth. The fact that this separation occurs at the threshold gives some awesome climactic tension of the story. If Orpheus had turned around halfway through their journey, it wouldn't have been nearly upsetting, don't you think? In this part of the story, we've also encountered another conflict. According to our previous discussion, what type of conflict it is if there is a struggle within oneself? It is an internal conflict, particularly man versus self or character versus self. Which event in the story is this type of conflict evident? Right. when Orpheus looked back to make sure Eurydice is still behind him. It shows how humans are curious and give in to temptations. We clearly observed how Orpheus faced his own choice, fears, flaws, and emotions. There is indeed an internal struggle which can make us think that uncertainty overpowers conscience. Let's continue. As Orpheus turned back to Eurydice, he caught one last glimpse of her arms stretched out to him. She just barely manages to say farewell as she was carried back to the underworld. He tries to enter the underworld a second time, but this time the ferryman on the river Styx won't let him pass. It is therefore the section of the plot in which the tension stemming from the story's center conflict decreases and the story moves toward its conclusion, or simply, the falling action. You would remember in our previous session I mentioned that the falling action helps us more fully understand the characters by showing us what choices they make after they face the crucial moment that all their actions had been leading up to. Most probably, the crucial moment is when Orpheus chose to look back at Eurydice, which made them fail to reunite with one another. Eventually, Orpheus wandered back to the earth, grieving the loss of Eurydice for the second time while singing the sad song to the trees and longed for the time when he too would die and be reunited with his beloved Eurydice in the underworld. And that's how the story of Orpheus and Eurydice ends. It is not that uplifting, and it does not offer us a typical happy ending, but it adds closure to the reader. Now let's talk about the story's tone and mood. The tone of the story of Orpheus is serious. It focuses on the sincerity of love and the passion that encompasses it, making the literature serious. Because of its serious tone, the readers are able to see the author's approach to the parts of the story much clearer. The author sets the tone of the story through a gloomy and resigned Orpheus after he lost Eurydice the second time around. What about the mood? What certain feelings or vibes did the story evoke to you? The tale of these two lovers is somewhat tragic. Due to circumstances, we can say that the mood of this story is generally a melancholy one as Orpheus loses his wife, momentarily brings her back, and then loses her again, all at the will of the gods. Lastly, let's talk about the story's theme. Considering that it is a love story, I know that most of you can relate and were greatly affected by it. So what do you think is the underlying message of the story? Love persists beyond death. When Eurydice dies, Orpheus mourns for her. His true love is now gone, but the power of death was not as strong as his love. He bends the will of Hades and goes down into the underworld to get her. Hence, one theme of the story is the power of love. Love is stronger than death itself. That's the story of Orpheus and Eurydice. And that is also how you identify the story elements. If you have questions or you want to clarify something about what has been discussed, you are free to type or key in your concerns in the comment box, and I will answer them as much as I can. A minute will be given for you to send your queries, and our teacher moderator will be gathering them. Your 1 minute starts now. Your time's up. I hope you were able to send your questions. Thank you so much to our teacher moderator who gathered them. If in case your question will not be addressed today, do not worry because it will be discussed by your English teacher on the follow-up discussion. I will now start reading some of your questions and answer them as well. Let's address the question from Citero Francisco Memorial National High School. Why is the setting of the underworld important to the development of the theme? Well, the use of underworld as a setting is important to locate the readers where the theme is being developed, how the characters relate to that place, what can happen to a place like this, among other things. Also, do not forget that the setting is important to the theme because some settings are better fitted to certain themes. It conveys a sense of atmosphere, which helps convey the more implicit elements of a theme. Since our theme has something to do with how love persists beyond death, the setting of the underworld enhances it. The place is dangerous to go to, but our main character did not hesitate because of his love for his wife. If the story happened in other places, maybe the theme would be different. A story's theme and setting are intertwined, and if written well, the two complement one another. Second question is from Lingunan National High School. Why did Hades give condition to Orpheus? The exact reason behind the condition of Hades regarding the retrieval of Eurydice' soul was not directly stated in the story. However, the possible reasons could be Hades may have wanted to test Orpheus' faith and his word by giving the condition of not looking at Eurydice until they have reached the outside world. He may have wanted to know whether this young man trusted him or not. Another is he wanted to test Orpheus. He wanted to find out how determined he is to be with Eurydice again. We've also got a query from Polo National High School. How do the story elements help the readers understand the selection? Story elements serve as guide to help the readers comprehend the story and to also make sure that the parts of the story have transitions that would not cause any confusion to them. Always remember that understanding a story can be a lot easier if you know how to distinguish its elements. While each element is individually essential to the story, how they interact with one another is even more important to what happens and how the story ends. I sincerely hope I was able to answer all your queries. Thank you for sending us your questions. It just shows that you really listened to our discussion and you have learned a lot from our session today. Your participation throughout the discussion just proves that you are now ready for your follow-up class discussion with your English teachers. Evidently, nobody knows when this pandemic will end, but one thing is for sure, education is endless. Just like what the current Department of Education battle cry says, anuman ang sitwasyon, tuloy ang edukasyon. This is Ma'am Eileen L. Crisostomo, your virtual teacher. Thank you for watching till our next virtual engagement.